So I was surfing the Twitter universe, the Twitterverse. Is that how you say it? Is that what the kids say? And
You can be one of the kids, Doug.
according to the
You
Muslim,
trend,
according to the
be a
nice Muslim
trendsetter.
guy I talked to yesterday, you're not old until you get into your 50s. So I am a young man.
Nice.
Yeah. So Travis Berry had a great comment. I loved it. He said that every atheist commits the naturalistic fallacy because there are only descriptions and one can't get a prescription from description. And I agree with that. Do you agree with that? That you can't get a
Yep.
prescription from a description?
Generally, I think it's very challenging to connect those two dots.
Yes, very challenging. So even though I agreed with him, me thinking ahead, I think I know what he means by that, why he posted it, showing inconsistency in worldviews. But the problem I see is that the is-ought problem, the prescription from description problem, still is within his worldview. And so I asked him, well, first I wanted to clarify and I asked him, is the Hume's is-ought problem that God commands it, thus it ought to be done? So I'm basically asking him, are you saying that you can get an is from, or no, an ought from an is because God commands it? And he said no, which didn't really shock me because I knew that I didn't put the word God's nature or the phrase God nature in it. And that's why he said no. So then I changed it and I said, is the Christian's answer to Hume's is ought problem that we ought to do whatever reflect your God's nature? And then he responded, yes, and then some. He is an absolute personality, thus he commands that which reflects his nature, which is a prescription. So then I asked him back, why ought I follow your God's commands which reflect his nature? So I'm trying to show him that you still can't get an ought from an is just because God says it. Why ought I do it?
Yeah, this is a point often lost on theists, it seems. They don't quite seem to realize that with all their protestation around um, the subjectivity of morality, um, that they kind of argue against themselves by doing so.
So the way he responded to that was to quote Psalm 18:30, which talks about God being truth and God being the protector. Which the protector part, I think he's getting closer to my worldview. Like if he's saying you ought to follow God's commands because you'll be protected, I can sort of buy into that if it was true, because it's more goals oriented now, right? It's you have a goal. Your goal is protection. So if you do this, you will be protected. But instead of going that route, I basically said, why ought I care about your God's promises or protection? Maybe I don't want protection from your God. Maybe I don't care about your God's promises. So again, you still have this problem. How do I get an ought from this is that God is a promise keeper, God is a protector? And he basically said, read that verse again and have a good night. And then I assured him that I do agree with his first statement that you can't get a prescription from a description. And I'm hoping that he realizes that that's what he's doing. He's getting a prescription from a description, and the description is this all-powerful creator God who commands things. And a command is a prescription, right? However, you still have the problem of how do you get to why I ought to obey these commands.
Yeah, and the difficult thing is they appeal to God's nature, and that's all well and good. But if they think it's fair to do so, then my question would be, why isn't it fair for us to do so as well? So if, for example, it is the case that pretty much every human being on the planet, at least the vast majority of them, don't value suffering pain. That is, they, in fact, value it in the opposite direction. And that's like the true state of affairs. And it's our nature that we effectively don't value pain or don't like pain. Why isn't it that if they think it's okay to derive effectively an ought from a nature, why is it not okay for us to derive an ought from a nature too?
Yeah. And again, this is whenever I am talking to a presup, I imagine how they will answer the exact same question they ask of me. And all I have to do is change a few words and give that same answer back to them. And that's exactly what you just did. So I think what it comes down to for them is, well, Doug, if you don't derive an ought from God's God's commandments, you'll suffer eternity in hell. So that's a pretty good reason, isn't it, Doug? Do you want to suffer eternity in hell? And so I think
Yeah, but you can see how that doesn't work. It's like, just to once again repeat the same game, but using our own technique. Like we could just simply go, well, behaving in certain immoral ways is not in your best interest because it makes friction in society. It makes it difficult for you to function and maintain a job. You might end up in jail. You don't really want to be in jail. It might have bad effects on your children, and you really love your children. Like, those are all things too. Like, those are all consequences of actions. Like, are you just saying that that you're okay with the way that my morality is derived?
Yeah, but again, they could say, well, that's just temporary pain and suffering, whereas, you atheists will suffer eternal suffering.
So it's not it's the quantity, not the quality.
Well, both. They would say that the hell that their God has concocted is far worse suffering and longer than anything we would experience here on earth. That's why you ought to obey this God. But even if it's true, everything they say, how sad is it that this is the reason why they ought to worship their God? Really, it's because of this huge threat of pain and suffering.
Hmm.
That's a hard pill to swallow, I think, even for Christians to hear, if that's the real ultimate answer to the is-ought problem.
Yeah, is it a hard? I mean, it certainly would be for a lot, but I have run into a fair few theists who don't seem to. I mean, I don't know exactly what it is, whether or not it's a failure of imagination, or if it's a personal lack of empathy or something, but they don't seem to see hell in the same gross way that I do.
Yeah, I think the whole idea of justice is people like it. They like seeing or thinking, at least, that okay, we have child molesters running around on this planet, and they might get away with it all their lives, but just you wait. When they die, they'll get what's coming to them. And this is appealing to many people. So I can see how some people kind of cling on to that concept of hell. But what I think a lot of Armenian Christians, the Calvinists not so much, but a lot of Armenian Christians would have to admit that you could be a child molester who dies at the age of 80, but for 79 of those, or let's say the vast majority of those years, molested children, but on his deathbed gave his life to Christ, and now this child molester is now in heaven. So what kind of justice is that?
Well, I mean, to be fair, the Calvinists have to deal with that problem as well, is that they just seem to think that they have a better judgment over which people God actually elected versus which people didn't. Because I think in their view, there's nothing saying that a person must be elected at a specific time in their life, right?
Right.
So, like, it's at least consistent with their view that somebody could genuinely be like regenerated by God on their deathbed.
So, how do you answer the question, the is-ought dilemma?
Mostly, actually, the way that I described, and I gave the theist a little bit of a prod to sort of demonstrate how what I'm doing is no less valid than what they are doing, but it's effectively an acknowledgement of the fact that biologically and structurally, like the way that we are as humans, we have a lot of commonality among us. And a lot of shared values, in particular, what we are okay with other people doing to us in our body, a dislike for pain, a like for feelings of contentment, and a likes for feelings of like some kind of, I guess, like harmony with each other, and fellow human beings. And I think that, like, that might sound like a very vague description, but there are a lot of components to it, and so it's a very difficult thing to quickly summarize. But the main point is that there are aspects about ourselves that mean that there are ises in the world, such as the way we're constituted, what typically happens in terms of cause and effects in the way that we behave, to the consequences that they have. And my version of the ought that comes out of it, it's not a logical ought which satisfies the is-ought problem, but it's the type of ought that I'm comfortable with, and I think it's meaningful enough for morality.
I'm going to play the role of the theist right now, because you mentioned consequences, that you can get some ises because we can, let's say, with a high degree of probability, because of cause and effect of the past, see what certain actions will end up happening, would end up doing to ourselves. What if the theist was to say to you, you ought to obey God's commands because he can see all foreseeable consequences? He's omniscient, and he can relay this information to you in some way. Maybe it's not a perfect way, but he can help you navigate some of these consequences. And that is why you ought to listen to him.
So I would say that I think that that's true. Like, if all the parts of that story were true, I mean, depending on
Yeah.
on what the God was actually like, of course, because maybe the God is like looking at all the consequences that would occur on the basis of action and is actually encouraging me to do something that I think is horrible. And they just simply have different values to me. The God does, that is. But yeah, back to yeah.
What I would add, like, let's say if I'm playing the role of a Travis Berry, I love that answer, but I would add, is there any evidence that that's actually happening? That
Oh yeah.
that the theists are actually living better lives and navigating through the world in a way that they are having less negative consequences put upon them.
Well, yeah, but I mean, they could easily appeal to consequences not obvious to our eyes, because the concern of God is not actions that produce positive consequences for you in your life on earth, but maybe instead positive consequences in the hereafter. Now, yeah, what you led on to say about the evidence in terms of positive consequences for theists, I would also say, what is the evidence that this God, that justifies the story in the first place? Like, it's all well and good to erect the story, that like, there is this oracle out there that gives us great information and tells us perfect things about how we should live our lives. But, unless I give you a good reason to believe that oracle exists, anybody can invent a story like that. It doesn't need to be the Christian theist. It could be the Muslim theist. It could be the Hindu, or it could be the Buddhist. I mean, it doesn't really matter what. And it could also be like some abstract idea about a programmer that created this world as like a simulation and is actually feeding through little bits of information to tell us how to live our lives. Like, I mean, it's just like, have I given you a reason to believe that, Doug? No, I haven't. So should you take me seriously? No, you shouldn't.